September 1942, Dow Field, Maine. The cold Atlantic wind swept across the tarmac as 10 young men gathered beneath the gleaming aluminum wings of a brand-new Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. Captain Robert K. Morgan, a lanky pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, ran his hand along the fuselage of serial number 41-2-4485, feeling the rivets beneath his palm. This aircraft had been added to the USAAF inventory on July 15, 1942, and was delivered in September 1942 to the 91st Bombardment Group. What none of these men knew was that they were about to become part of the most celebrated bomber crew in American history, not through Hollywood fantasy, but through the brutal arithmetic of survival against odds that defied statistical probability. The crew would fly their B-17 across the Atlantic to England, where they would join the 324th Bombardment Squadron of the 91st Bombardment Group at RAF Bassingbourn. But first, Morgan had promised his crew a stop. They flew south to Tennessee, to the city that would give their aircraft its name. There, in Memphis, Morgan christened the bomber after his girlfriend, Margaret Polk, though he originally wanted to call it Little One, his pet name for her. After seeing a film where a character owned a riverboat called Memphis Belle, the name stuck. Young Margaret Polk became an unwitting icon, her image soon to be painted on the nose of a bomber that would face death over occupied Europe. The Memphis Belle deployed to Prestwick, Scotland on September 30, 1942, moving to a temporary base at RAF Kimballton on October 1st, before arriving at its permanent home at RAF Bassingbourn, England, on October 14th. The base, just north of London in the gentle countryside of Cambridgeshire, would be their home for the next 7 months. What awaited them was a test of endurance that would push human courage to its absolute limits. The mathematics were terrifying. When America entered the war in Europe flying sorties from English bases, losses were as high as 82%. In interviews much later, Morgan summed up the horror describing the awful casualties. 80% losses means you have breakfast with 10 men and dinner with only 2 of them. The War Department had established a combat tour threshold. Crews needed to complete this number of missions before they could go home. But in those early dark days of late 1942 and early 1943, reaching that number seemed mathematically impossible. Of those who flew the original 25-mission bomber tour in 1942 to 1943, just 35% survived. November 7th, 1942. The crew of the Memphis Belle flew their first combat mission, targeting submarine pens at Brest, France. They lifted off from Bassingbourn in the pre-dawn darkness, part of a formation of B-17s heading across the English Channel. The young men had trained for months, but nothing could prepare them for what they were about to experience. The United States Army Air Forces entered World War II with the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama. The Air Force went into World War II and unescorted daylight precision bombing without the semblance of a long-range escort fighter in its planning. The British predicted horrible losses during daylight raids, and they were right. American P-47 Thunderbolts and Royal Air Force Spitfires provided only short-range escort, and when these fighters reached their operational range near the western border of Germany, they peeled off and returned to base, leaving the American bombers at the mercy of the German Luftwaffe. 2 days after their first mission, on November 9th, they flew to Saint-Nazaire, then again on November 17th. The American bomb groups were taking on tough, well-defended targets, including submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire and Brest, docks and shipbuilding installations at Wilhelmshaven, railroad yards at Rouen, and aircraft factories at Antwerp. The German submarine pens, massive concrete structures designed to protect U-boats from bombing, proved nearly indestructible. Yet the 8th Air Force kept sending bombers against them. December brought winter and continued operations. On December 6th, they struck locomotive works at Lille, France. On December 20th, they bombed the airfield at Romilly-sur-Seine. Each mission was a roll of the dice. Each time they returned to Bassingbourn, they counted the empty dispersal hardstands where aircraft that had left that morning would never return. The Memphis Belle herself was taking tremendous punishment. On 5 separate occasions she had engines shot out. Once she came back with her tail nearly shot off. She was bullet-ridden, flak-damaged, yet there was not one major injury to the crew members. This fact alone seemed to defy probability. 1943 opened with no respite. January 3rd saw them back over Saint-Nazaire. January 13th took them to Lille. On January 23rd, they attacked submarine pens at Lorient. In the flak-filled sky over the German U-boat installation at Lorient on January 23rd, 1943, Memphis Belle was battling for her life, penetrating a protective screen of German fighters, then threading through a thick blanket of anti-aircraft fire, holding steady with no evasive manoeuvres. It was late January 1943 when Hollywood arrived at Bassingbourn. Major William Wyler, who had made acclaimed films like Wuthering Heights and Mrs. Miniver, joined the U.S. Army Air Force to make documentaries about the war in Europe. Morgan states in his memoirs that he was approached by Wyler in late January 1943 after his crew's 8th mission. Wyler told Morgan he wanted to film the Memphis Belle and her crew because of a certain mystique to the aircraft's nickname, and that Morgan's reputation as a pilot meant that Wyler would be in the centre of the action with a pretty good chance of coming back. Wyler had originally been following Captain Oscar O'Neill, whose bomber was named Invasion 2nd, of the 401st Bomb Squadron. But on April 17, 1943, O'Neill's fate was sealed. O'Neill's B-17 and 5 others of the 401st were shot down over Bremen, Germany, in what was at that time the most costly mission yet for the 8th Air Force. Wyler needed a new subject. Morgan and the Memphis Belle became his focus. February 4th brought their 9th mission, to Emden, Germany, their first strike into Germany proper. February 14th saw them attack Ham, Germany. Then, on February 16th, the Memphis Belle took severe battle damage over Saint-Nazaire. The Memphis Belle was being repaired after severe battle damage incurred on February 16th. While ground crews laboured to repair their bomber, Wyler's first filmed mission was not aboard the Memphis Belle, but aboard the B-17 Jersey Bounce on February 26, 1943, to Wilhelmshaven, Germany, while the Memphis Belle was being repaired. The mission experienced heavy German fighter attacks, and 2 of the 91st Group's B-17s were shot down. Despite the hazards, Wyler filmed at least 6 more combat missions with Morgan's crew, not all aboard the Memphis Belle, using cameras mounted in the nose, tail, right waist and radio hatch positions. The cost of documenting this war was measured in lives. First Lieutenant Harold J. Tannenbaum, a veteran of World War I and one of 3 cinematographers, was killed in action during filming when the bomber he was in was shot down over France on April 16, 1943. Wyler suffered from frostbite and lost his hearing for months after being on bombing runs. Back in combat, the Memphis Belle crew continued accumulating missions. March brought strikes to Lorient on the 6th, Rouen on the 12th and 13th, Wilhelmshaven on the 22nd, and back to Rouen on the 28th. April saw missions to Antwerp on the 5th, Lorient on the 16th, and the costly Bremen raid on the 17th. May brought them to Saint-Nazaire on the 1st and Antwerp on the 4th. By mid-May 1943 they were approaching the threshold. The race was on among several bombers to complete their combat tours. A B-17F nicknamed Delta Rebel No. 2 completed 25 credited combat missions on May 1, 1943, becoming the first B-17 in the European theatre to complete the feat. Hell's Angels, a B-17F of the 303rd Bombardment Group, completed 25 combat missions on May 13, 1943. But neither would return to the United States for a publicity tour. The Memphis Belle crew hit that milestone without a crewman's death, making her the likely candidate to be first to return home for a war bond tour. Tragically, Delta Rebel No. 2 was shot down during the August 12, 1943 mission to Gelsenkirchen, Germany, with 6 of its crew captured as prisoners of war and 4 killed in action. May 15th brought their 24th mission to Wilhelmshaven. Just one more mission, and they would complete their tour. Wyler's film actually depicted this next to last mission on May 15th, 1943. Wyler had informed Morgan that had the Memphis Belle been shot down on the crew's final mission, he had a backup crew working with another B-17 about to finish its 25 missions, Hell's Angels of the nearby 303rd Bombardment Group. May 17, 1943. The Memphis Belle flew her 25th and final combat mission, bombing the massive Karaman submarine base at Lorient, France. She flew 148 hours, 50 minutes, and covered more than 20,000 combat miles during her 25 missions. During her 25 missions, Memphis Belle gunners were credited with shooting down 8 enemy fighters, with another 5 probable kills, and damaged at least a dozen more. Her crew dropped more than 60 tons of bombs over France, Germany, and Belgium. They had done it. They had beaten the odds. The crew was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and 3 oak leaf clusters each. Only Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan received a Purple Heart for being officially wounded. King George VI, wearing the uniform of a Marshal of the Royal Air Force, and Queen Elizabeth congratulated the crew on May 18th. 10 young Americans stood before the King and Queen of England, men who had brought the war to Nazi Germany and lived to tell about it. The Memphis Belle was flown back to the United States on June 8, 1943, by a composite crew chosen by the 8th Air Force, led by Captain Morgan for a 31-city war bond tour. Morgan's original co-pilot, Captain James A. Varinis, had piloted Memphis Belle for 1 mission before being promoted to aircraft commander of another B-17 named Connecticut Yankee for his final 16 missions, finishing his tour on May 13th, but he rejoined Morgan's crew as co-pilot for the flight back to the United States. The crew that completed the tour represented America itself. They ranged in age from 19 to 26 and came from states across the U.S., including Washington, Indiana, Texas, and Connecticut. Captain Robert K. Morgan, the pilot from Asheville, North Carolina, was 24 years old. Captain James A. Varinis from Woodbridge, Connecticut. Captain Charles B. Layton, navigator from Flint, Michigan. Captain Vincent B. Evans, bombardier from Fort Worth, Texas. Technical Sergeant Robert J. Hanson, radio operator from Walla Walla, Washington. Technical Sergeant Harold P. Loch, top turret gunner and engineer from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Staff Sergeant Cecil H. Scott, ball turret gunner from Arapahoe, North Carolina. Staff Sergeant John P. Quinlan, tail gunner from Yonkers, New York. Staff Sergeant Casimir A. Nastal, waist gunner from Detroit, Michigan. Staff Sergeant Clarence E. Winchell, waist gunner from Oak Park, Illinois. Notably absent was Staff Sergeant E. Scott Miller, the right waist gunner from Kingwood, West Virginia. Miller flew 15 missions aboard the Belle, but missed the tour because he hadn't flown 25 missions yet. While his crewmates were celebrated across America, Miller remained in England, continuing to fly combat missions until he completed his own tour. His contribution would be overlooked for decades. Also accompanying them was Stuka. Stuka, a Scottish terrier bought by co-pilot Jim Varinis in a London pet store, accompanied the crew and participated in the tour. In a war of such magnitude and horror, the presence of this small dog provided a touch of normalcy. The crew visited more than 32 cities where they received heroes' welcomes, including Washington, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Wichita, and Mobile. Bond rallies were held throughout the country. But the Memphis Belle crew brought something different than Hollywood stars. They were men who had faced death repeatedly and survived. In Captain Morgan's hometown of Asheville, on the final night, the City Fathers held a party and reception at the City Hall auditorium where each crew member spoke. Morgan, in a sentimental mood, reminisced about mountain moonshine and promised to fly it around the country after the war. The home folks loved it. These young men, barely out of their teens, had become symbols of American courage. At every stop, crowds gathered. People wanted to touch the aircraft, see the bullet holes and flak damage, meet the men who had flown her. The tour served three purposes: that combat crews in training could be guided to achieve combat efficiency, that production workers in factories could see what they were building being used, and that the American people could be shown what the war was about. But the tour also revealed tensions beneath the heroic narrative. The tour would be difficult for Jim Varinis, as it marked the start of living in Bob Morgan's shadow, something he did for the rest of his life, when the press eternally dubbed him as the Memphis Belle's co-pilot, despite the fact that he had commanded Connecticut Yankee for 20 missions and beat Morgan to 25 missions. The narrative demanded a single hero, and Morgan filled that role. The nuances and complexities of crew dynamics were sacrificed for the simplicity of storytelling. The relationship between Morgan and Margaret Polk also became strained, with their breakup occurring during the latter stages of the tour. The young romance that had inspired the aircraft's name could not withstand the pressures of fame and the changes war had wrought in both of them. After 3 months touring America, the Memphis Belle's combat days were over. On December 23, 1943, the Memphis Belle was assigned to MacDill Field, Florida, where it became a B-17 aircrew and ground crew training aircraft, remaining there until after victory in Europe Day. The aircraft that had survived combat missions would now teach others how to survive their own missions. The bomber that had faced German flak and fighters would spend the rest of the war preparing new crews for what awaited them over Europe. After VE Day, the aircraft was flown to Altus Army Airfield, Oklahoma, for storage and eventual reclamation. In vast fields across America, thousands of aircraft sat waiting for the scrappers. The industrial might that had produced them now had no use for them. The Memphis Belle seemed destined for the same fate as thousands of other warbirds, to be cut up and melted down. But the mayor of Memphis, Walter Chandler, intervened, arranging for the city of Memphis to buy the B-17 for $350. $350, less than the cost of a single mission's fuel. It was flown to Memphis in July 1946 and stored until mid-1949, when the bomber was placed on display at the National Guard Armory near the city's fairgrounds. It sat out of doors into the 1980s, slowly deteriorating from weather and vandalism. The famous bomber, which had survived German fighters and flak, was now being destroyed by something far more insidious: neglect and the passage of time. Paint peeled, aluminum corroded, vandals left their marks. The Memphis Belle, sitting exposed to the elements in Memphis, was slowly dying. After relentless efforts by Frank D'Onofrio, a local businessman, the city agreed to donate land on Mud Island, where the historic bomber could be displayed. Federal Express and Boeing each donated $100,000 toward restoration, and the city donated $150,000. When Hugh Downs of TV's 2020 aired the need for more money, the American people donated the rest of the $576,000 needed. On May 17, 1987, 44 years after she flew her 25th mission, the Memphis Belle Pavilion was dedicated with nearly 25,000 in attendance. 7 B-17s, the largest formation since World War II, flew overhead in salute and bombed the pavilion with thousands of rose petals. Margaret Polk and the Belle crew looked on as the crowd cheered thunderously. It was a moment of triumph, the famous bomber finally receiving the care and respect it deserved. Margaret Polk, who helped in fundraising for the association, died in 1990. But the outdoor display on Mud Island, while well-intentioned, could not provide the controlled environment necessary for long-term preservation. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force indicated they wanted it back for restoration and eventual display at Wright-Patterson AFB near Dayton, Ohio. The Belle arrived at the museum in mid-October 2005 and was placed in one of the museum's restoration hangars, having been trucked in corroded pieces after efforts in Memphis ran out of money. What followed was one of the most meticulous aircraft restorations in history. It took some 55,000 hours to restore the plane to its wartime glory. 55,000 hours of careful, painstaking work by people who understood the significance of what they were doing. More than 100 people, mostly volunteers, worked on the four-engine bomber. After stripping paint from the aft fuselage, hundreds of names and personal messages were found scratched in the aluminum skin. These scratches, left by visitors over decades, told their own story. People had wanted to leave their mark, to somehow connect themselves to this famous aircraft. Restoration specialist Casey Simmons noted that priority one was getting it right, fabricating even parts no visitor would ever see, like a glycol heater missing from inside the left wing. The restoration team was committed to making the aircraft complete and authentic, even in parts that would never be visible to the public. Many parts long since out of production caused restorers to make new parts by hand, sometimes with only a fragment of an old part or without blueprints. These skilled craftsmen were not simply fixing an old airplane. They were preserving a piece of history, ensuring that future generations could see and understand what the men of the 8th Air Force had flown into combat. On March 14, 2018, the Memphis Belle was moved into the museum's World War II gallery in a private event and was officially unveiled 2 months later on May 17, 2018, the 75th anniversary of completing its 25th mission. Robert K. Morgan Jr.'s voice wavered with emotion when he talked about seeing the Memphis Belle all put together for the first time in 50 years. His father had flown the legendary B-17F on 25 perilous bombing missions and worked the rest of his life to make sure the airplane was preserved. Morgan Jr. said his father knew before he passed that the plane was going to come to the museum, that they couldn't keep it in Memphis, and he was extremely glad it would be preserved and restored there. The documentary that William Wyler created became part of the Memphis Belle's enduring legacy. The 16mm colour film used did not include sound, which was added later in Hollywood. The original crew, during their war bonds drive, made appropriate comments to each other while watching the silent movie in a studio, with the result being difficult to distinguish from real combat recordings. Over 15 hours of film shot by Wyler and his cinematographers resides at the National Archives. In 2016, documentary filmmaker Eric Nelson became aware that the 34 reels of raw footage were available in the National Archives. He led a team that replaced scratched and faded frames, and after restoration he used the 90 hours of film to cut a new documentary entitled The Cold Blue. The crew members lived full lives after the war, though they carried memories that set them apart. Robert K. Morgan was hospitalized April 22, 2004, with a fractured vertebra in his neck after falling outside the Asheville Regional Airport while returning home from an air show. He died at Mission Hospital on May 15, 2004 from complications due to his injuries, including pneumonia. James A. Verinis died on March 3, 2003. Cecil Scott retired from Ford Motor Company after 30 years, dying in 1979. The other crew members returned to ordinary civilian lives, became fathers and grandfathers, worked regular jobs, lived in suburbs across America. But the Memphis Belle's story was never just about one crew or one aircraft. A total of 350,000 airmen served with the 8th Air Force in England, and 26,000 were killed, a rate of 7.42%. Compared to other military branches, US Marines 3.29%, US Army 2.25%, and US Navy 0.41%, the Air Corps sustained the heaviest losses. More airmen with the 8th Air Force lost their lives than the entire Marine Corps, whose enrollment included 250,000 more people. Strictly measuring the mortality rate for the 210,000 aircrewmen, the casualty figure soars to 12.38%, with 21,000 ending up in prison of war camps. The 250,000 aircrew members who flew bomber missions in 8th Air Force sustained 58,000 casualties, including 18,000 killed, 6,500 wounded, and 33,500 missing. In the midst of the heaviest combat against Germany, US bomber crew airmen had a 1 in 4 chance of survival. Think about that statistic. 1 in 4. If you were a bomber crewman in the early months of 1943, you had the same odds of surviving as a coin coming up heads twice in a row. The Memphis Belle crew had defied these odds not once or twice, but over 24 times. On some missions, losses were catastrophic, with the Ploesti mission in August 1943 seeing 30% losses, and the Schweinfurt mission in October seeing 28% losses. After Schweinfurt, the B-17s did not again fly deep into Germany until long-range P-51 fighters were available to escort them. The doctrine of unescorted daylight precision bombing had proven too costly. The North American P-51 Mustang became effective when it became the P-51B after its American Allison engine was replaced by the Packard supercharged version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in late 1942, with the first P-51BC fighters entering service in England in December 1943. Had the P-51 been available earlier, thousands of airmen's lives might have been saved. For the bomber offensive as a whole, 8th Air Force lost 4,182 aircraft from a total of 273,841 attacking, a rate of 1.5%. Yet even at 1.5%, when crews had to fly multiple missions, the mathematics were brutal. By 1945, 8th Air Force was operating at much lower altitudes and putting up to 60% of its bombs within 1,000 feet of the aiming point, almost 4 times better than in the dark days of 1943. The campaign evolved, improved, and ultimately succeeded in its objectives. But success came at a terrible price. Morgan remembered no easy missions, no milk runs. Every mission involved flying through flak so thick it looked like you could walk on it. Every mission involved German fighters attacking in waves. Every mission involved watching other bombers go down, seeing parachutes blossom against the sky, counting the chutes and knowing that not everyone made it out. At 25,000 feet, temperatures reached 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Frostbite was common. The oxygen was thin, requiring masks that often malfunctioned. The aircraft was not pressurized. The gunners stood at open waist windows, exposed to the screaming wind. The noise was deafening. The stress was constant. And through it all, the Memphis Belle crew persevered. Morgan decided the secret to a successful B-17 mission was tight formations, so tight that the wings often nearly touched in flight. This required absolute concentration and trust. A moment's inattention could cause a mid-air collision. The crew chief also deserves recognition. Joe Giambroni from Hulnerville, Pennsylvania, saw to the replacement of 9 engines, both wings, 2 tails, both main landing gear and more to keep the Belle in top form. While the flight crew received the medals and the publicity, ground crews like Giambrone made it possible for aircraft to keep flying. They worked through English winters, often in the open, performing miracles of maintenance and repair. The Memphis Belle's survival was partly luck, but it was also due to Morgan's skill as a pilot and the professionalism of his crew. They worked together seamlessly, each man knowing his job and doing it well under conditions of extreme stress. This teamwork, this mutual trust and competence made the difference between survival and death. After completing their tour, several crew members wanted to continue fighting. Casimir Nastel returned to the European theatre after the publicity tour and completed a total of 60 combat missions. John Quinlan tried unsuccessfully to fly again with Robert Morgan in the Pacific Theatre, but was eventually assigned to the China-Burma-India Theatre, where he downed 3 Zeros to become a gunner ace before his B-29 was shot down. These men, having survived the impossible once, chose to face it again. Morgan himself flew a second combat tour in the Pacific Theatre, commanding a B-29 superfortress named Dauntless Dottie, that led the first B-29 raid on Tokyo on November 24, 1944. The story of the Memphis Belle is ultimately a story about ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. None of these men were born heroes. They were farm boys and factory workers, students and salesmen. They volunteered or were drafted, went through training, and found themselves in the deadliest air war in history. And they rose to the challenge. They did not think of themselves as heroes. In interviews after the war, they consistently deflected praise, talked about doing their jobs, emphasized the contributions of others. This humility, this reluctance to claim special status, was characteristic of their generation. They had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. But we can recognize what they accomplished, even if they could not. They flew into the face of death 24 times and returned. They helped prove that daylight precision bombing could work, even if the initial doctrine needed major modifications. They inspired a nation that desperately needed inspiration in the dark days of early 1943. They became symbols of American determination and courage. Today, the Memphis Belle sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force, restored to perfection. The plane embodies as much symbolism for the Air Force in its fight over the war-torn skies of Europe as the raising of the American flag on Iwo Jima for the Marine Corps, or the USS Arizona Battleship Memorial at Pearl Harbor for the Navy. The bomber sits with bomb bay doors open, propellers attached, nose art gleaming. Mission markers and fighter kill symbols are painted on the fuselage. Every rivet, every panel, every instrument has been carefully restored. It looks as it did on that May Day in 1943 when it returned from Lorient for the last time. But this is not the Hollywood version. This is not a sanitized, simplified story of heroic Americans easily defeating evil Germans. This is a story of young men, barely out of their teens, who climbed into aluminum aircraft every few days and flew into the teeth of the most concentrated air defenses in history. Men who knew that, statistically, they probably would not survive. Men who did it anyway because it needed to be done. The real story of the Memphis Belle is not just about one crew beating the odds. It is about what that achievement represented to everyone else still fighting. In late 1942 and early 1943, when bomber losses were catastrophic and survival seemed impossible, the Memphis Belle crew kept flying and kept surviving. They became proof that it could be done. They became hope for all the other crews still flying missions, still facing those terrible odds. And when they completed their combat tour and returned to the United States, they carried that hope with them. At every Bond rally, at every factory, at every training base they visited, they were living proof that survival was possible. They were evidence that American air power could reach into the heart of Nazi Germany and return home. They were, in the most literal sense, flying propaganda, but propaganda based on truth. The Memphis Belle stands as a memorial to all who served in the strategic bombing campaign. This aircraft survived combat missions when survival seemed statistically impossible. It carried 10 men through the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition in history and brought them all home. The young men who flew this bomber did not think of themselves as heroes, but they were. And the Memphis Belle, beautifully restored and honoured, ensures that their story will never be forgotten. When visitors walk through the National Museum of the United States Air Force and see this aluminum bird, meticulously restored to its 1943 configuration, they are looking at more than just an airplane. They are looking at a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of freedom. They should remember that this aircraft represents thousands of other bombers that did not survive. They should remember the tens of thousands of airmen who died in the skies over Europe. They should remember the courage it took to climb into these aircraft day after day, knowing the odds, knowing that statistically they would not survive, and doing it anyway because it was their duty. The Memphis Belle's legacy extends beyond World War II. It influenced how America thinks about air power, about strategic bombing, about the men who fly into harm's way. It became part of the American story, a chapter in the narrative of the greatest generation. It inspired books, films, documentaries, and countless articles. It captured the imagination of the American people in 1943 and continues to do so today. The aircraft itself is one of only a handful of B-17Fs still in existence. Most were scrapped after the war. Those that survived often ended as gate guards or were modified beyond recognition. The Memphis Belle, through a combination of fame, luck, and the efforts of dedicated people over decades, survived largely intact. Its restoration allows current and future generations to see what these aircraft actually looked like, to understand their size and complexity, to appreciate the technology and engineering that went into them. The 10 crew members who flew the Memphis Belle to completion of their tour were among the lucky ones. They survived. They came home. They had lives and families and careers. But they never forgot their time over Europe, never forgot the friends who did not make it back, never forgot what it felt like to fly through flak and fighters, never forgot the fear and the adrenaline and the bone-deep exhaustion. In the end, the real story of the Memphis Belle is about all the crews, all the aircraft, all the missions. It is about the strategic bombing campaign that helped win World War II. It is about the cost of that victory, measured not just in aircraft lost or bombs dropped, but in lives forever changed, in young men aged beyond their years, in families who lost sons and brothers and fathers. The Memphis Belle stands as witness to all of this, and every visitor who walks past this beautifully restored aircraft should pause and reflect on what it represents: the courage, the sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of the men who flew into the flak-filled skies of World War II, and against all odds, came home.